Rain hammered the tin roof of the auto shop like 1,000 tiny fists, and Daniel Reyes was almost done wiping grease off his hands when he saw her. An elderly woman standing alone under the flickering streetlight across the road, soaked to the bone, clutching a thin cardigan around her shoulders as if it could hold back the whole storm. If you've ever had a moment where your gut told you to stop everything and help a stranger, stay with me until the end of this story, because what happened next changed 3 lives forever. And if stories about ordinary people doing extraordinary things move you the way they move me, hit that like button and subscribe, because there's a lot more heart where this came from. Daniel didn't think twice. He grabbed the old shop umbrella from behind the counter, locked up the register, and jogged across the flooded street toward her. She looked lost, confused, blinking against the rain like she didn't know how she'd gotten there. Up close, he could see she was maybe 70, 75, with silver hair plastered to her forehead, and eyes that carried both fear and a strange, quiet dignity. "Ma'am, are you okay? Do you need help?" Daniel asked, holding the umbrella over her. She looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether to trust a stranger with grease-stained hands and a faded flannel shirt. Finally, she spoke, her voice trembling. I don't remember where I was going." That was the moment Daniel's ordinary Tuesday night became something else entirely. He was 34 years old, a single father raising his 8-year-old daughter, Maya, on the income of a small auto repair shop he'd inherited from his own father. His wife had left 3 years earlier, unable to handle the pressure of a failing marriage and a business barely staying afloat. Since then, it had been just Daniel and Maya. Pancakes for dinner some nights, second-hand shoes, a leaky roof he kept promising to fix but never had the money to. Yet somehow, even with barely enough for himself, Daniel Reyes had never once turned away someone who needed help. His father used to say that the size of a man's wallet had nothing to do with the size of his heart, and Daniel had carried that lesson like scripture. He remembered as a boy, watching his father fix a stranger's transmission for free because the man was a war veteran who couldn't afford the part, let alone the labor. He remembered his father saying, wiping his hands on the same rag Daniel now used every single day, that a business built on greed collapses the first time the wind blows hard, but a business built on decency survives generations. Daniel had buried his father 4 years ago, right around the time his marriage began to crumble. And some nights, standing alone in that same shop long after closing, he swore he could still smell his father's cheap cigars lingering in the walls, still hear his voice reminding him who he was supposed to be even when the bills piled up and exhaustion pressed down on his shoulders like a physical weight. Raising Maya alone hadn't been part of any plan. There were nights he sat on the edge of her bed after she'd fallen asleep, terrified he was failing her. Terrified that love alone couldn't pay for new shoes or dentist visits or the birthday parties her classmates seemed to have without a second thought. But he kept going, the way his father had taught him, one stubborn sunrise at a time. He couldn't just leave this woman standing in the rain. So he did what felt right. He brought her into the shop, wrapped her in the old wool blanket he kept in his truck, and made her a cup of instant coffee on the little hot plate in the break room. She sat on a folding chair, hands shaking around the paper cup, and told him her name was Eleanor. She didn't know her last name. She didn't know her address. She only knew that her feet hurt, and that she was cold, and that, for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt safe with him. Daniel called the police non-emergency line, described her, and asked if anyone had reported a missing elderly woman. Nothing came up. He called 2 nearby hospitals. Nothing. It was nearly 11 at night. The storm was getting worse, and there was no shelter open that could take her until morning. Daniel looked at Eleanor, this frail stranger with kind, cloudy eyes, and made a decision that would ripple through his life in ways he could never have imagined. "You can stay with us tonight," he said. "I've got a daughter, and our house isn't much, but it's warm and it's dry. Tomorrow we'll figure out where you belong." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears. "Why would you do that for someone you don't even know?" Daniel just shrugged as he helped her into his truck. Because somebody has to. That night, Maya woke up to find a strange old woman sleeping in the guest room that used to be storage space. And instead of being scared, she tiptoed in with her favorite stuffed rabbit and set it gently on the pillow beside Eleanor's silver head, the way her father had taught her to comfort anyone who seemed sad. In the morning, Daniel found them at the kitchen table together. Maya teaching Eleanor how to fold a paper crane, Eleanor laughing for what looked like the first time in a long while. Over the next few days, Eleanor's memory came back in pieces, like fog slowly lifting off a lake. She remembered a house with white columns. She remembered a garden she used to tend. She remembered, faintly, an argument, raised voices, a slammed door, the feeling of being unwanted in her own home. But she couldn't remember names, couldn't remember exactly where the house was. And every time Daniel gently pressed for more details, her hands would start to shake, and her eyes would glaze with the kind of confusion that broke his heart. He took her to a free clinic, where a tired but kind doctor said what Daniel had already begun to suspect. Eleanor was showing signs of early dementia, likely compounded by extreme stress and possibly exposure from being outside for an unknown period of time. She needed rest, routine, and someone patient. Daniel didn't have much, but patience. Patience he had in abundance. At night, once Maya was asleep, Eleanor would sometimes sit on the porch steps with Daniel, wrapped in the same wool blanket from that first rainy night, and talk about fragments of a life that felt to her like it belonged to someone else. She spoke of a husband who had built something enormous out of a single delivery truck and sheer stubbornness, of long years spent raising a daughter mostly alone while he chased contracts across the country, of a loneliness that money had never quite managed to fill. She spoke of a daughter who had grown so driven, so relentlessly capable, that Eleanor sometimes worried she'd raised a woman who no longer knew how to simply sit still and rest. She never mentioned names with any certainty. The fog would roll back in before she could finish a sentence, but Daniel listened anyway, every single night, because he understood something that so many people forget. Sometimes being heard matters more than being remembered correctly. So the days turned into a week, and the week turned into 2. Daniel adjusted the shop's hours so he could check on Eleanor at lunch. Maya started drawing pictures for her, taping them to the wall of the little guest room, turning it from a storage space into something that finally looked like a home for someone. Eleanor, in turn, began to steady. She started cooking simple meals when her hands allowed it, filling the house with the smell of something Daniel hadn't tasted since his own mother passed away. Real cooking, made with love instead of rushed necessity. She mended Maya's torn school uniform with careful, practiced stitches. She sang old songs under her breath while she watered the single geranium on the windowsill, a plant Daniel had forgotten existed until Eleanor brought it back to life. It wasn't charity anymore. It had become something else, a family stitched together by accident and kindness. But Daniel wasn't foolish. He knew somewhere out there someone was likely missing Eleanor. He kept calling shelters, kept checking with local police, even posted a discreet, respectful notice at the community center, careful not to expose her in a way that might make her a target for anyone unscrupulous. Weeks passed with no answers, and Daniel began to wonder, quietly, guiltily, if maybe he simply didn't want to find her family. Maybe some small part of him had grown to love having her there, love the warmth she'd brought back into a house that had felt like it was just surviving rather than living. Then, on a Thursday afternoon in early autumn, everything changed. A sleek black car pulled up outside the auto shop, the kind of car that looked profoundly out of place next to the rusted pickups and dented sedans usually parked along that street. A woman stepped out, tall, sharply dressed in a tailored coat, sunglasses pushed up into perfectly styled dark hair. She moved like someone who was used to rooms going quiet when she entered them. Daniel wiped his hands on a rag and stepped out from under the hood of a Honda Civic, immediately sensing that this was not a customer looking for an oil change. "I'm looking for a man named Daniel Reyes," the woman said. Her voice clipped, controlled, though Daniel caught the faintest tremor underneath it. "I was told he might know something about my mother." Daniel's stomach dropped, in the good way and the terrifying way all at once. "Your mother's name is Eleanor?" The woman's composure cracked for just a second. "Yes, Eleanor Whitfield. She's been missing for 6 weeks. I hired 3 private investigators. I put up a reward, and I find out she's been living in some stranger's house this entire time." Her voice rose, sharp with a mixture of relief and fury that Daniel understood immediately. It was the sound of someone who had been terrified and was only now allowing herself to feel angry about it. "She was confused and alone in the pouring rain," Daniel said evenly, refusing to be intimidated. "I called the police. I called hospitals. Nobody had a missing persons report on file. I did everything I knew how to do, and when nothing worked, I made sure she was safe, warm, and cared for. That's all." The woman, whose name Daniel would soon learn, was Victoria Whitfield, CEO of one of the largest logistics and shipping conglomerates on the West Coast. A woman whose net worth exceeded a number Daniel couldn't fully picture, studied him with an expression that shifted from suspicion to something more complicated. She'd expected, she would later admit, to find a con artist, someone circling an old, wealthy, confused woman like a vulture, waiting for the right moment to drain her accounts, or worse. Instead, she found a mechanic in a stained work shirt, a modest house with a leaky roof, and her mother sitting at a kitchen table, healthier and more lucid than she'd seen her in over a year, teaching an 8-year-old girl how to knit. Eleanor looked up when Victoria walked through the door, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then Eleanor's face crumpled, not with confusion this time, but with recognition and pure aching love. "Vicky," she whispered. Victoria crossed the room in 3 steps and dropped to her knees beside her mother's chair, wrapping her arms around her, and for the first time since arriving in that neighborhood in her $100,000 car, she wasn't a billionaire CEO anymore. She was just a daughter who thought she'd lost her mother forever. Later that evening, after Eleanor had gone to rest and Maya had been sent to bed with a hug from a woman she now clearly considered part of the family, Victoria sat across from Daniel at the same worn kitchen table. She apologized for her earlier tone, and slowly, the real story came out. Eleanor had wandered off during a rare moment alone. In the confusion of an early dementia episode neither she nor her family had fully acknowledged yet. She'd taken a taxi to a part of the city she used to visit decades earlier, searching, in her disoriented state, for a house that no longer existed, a memory from a life before her husband's company became an empire, before the mansion, before the staff and the security systems, and the version of wealth that somehow made her feel more alone than she'd ever been in the small house of her childhood. Victoria had been consumed with grief and guilt, blaming herself for not noticing the early signs, for being too buried in board meetings and shareholder calls to see that her mother was slipping. "I offered a $200,000 reward," Victoria said quietly. "Do you know what that tells me? That money can move mountains, hire armies of investigators, put up billboards, but it took a stranger with almost nothing to actually save her, to actually see her." She looked around the small kitchen, the cracked linoleum, the taped-together chair leg, the drawing of a smiling stick-figure family taped proudly to the refrigerator. "You had every reason to walk away, every reason to call it someone else's problem, and you didn't." Daniel shrugged, the same way he had that first rainy night. "She needed help. That's it. That's the whole reason." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, studying him the way she studied companies before deciding whether to invest in them. Except this time, what she was measuring wasn't spreadsheets or growth projections. It was character. And Daniel Reyes, she realized, possessed more of it than most executives she'd ever sat across a boardroom table from. She told him later that night about the 6 weeks she'd endured, the sleepless nights pacing her penthouse office while investigators combed through security footage, The moment she'd had to cancel a major acquisition meeting because she couldn't stop shaking long enough to speak coherently. The guilt that had settled into her chest like a stone every time she remembered the last conversation she'd had with her mother before the disappearance. A rushed, distracted phone call cut short because of a board meeting Victoria now couldn't even recall the subject of. She admitted, quietly, that she had built her entire adult life around the fear of being like her mother. Soft, sentimental, easily hurt. And in doing so had built walls so high that she'd nearly missed the signs that the one person who loved her unconditionally was slipping away right in front of her. Daniel didn't offer platitudes. He simply listened, the same way he'd listened to Eleanor every night on that porch. And something about his silence felt more comforting than any of the carefully worded sympathy she'd received from her executive team over the past 6 weeks. Over the following weeks, something unexpected happened. Victoria didn't simply thank Daniel and disappear back into her world of private jets and quarterly earnings calls. She kept coming back, first to check on her mother, who insisted adamantly that she wanted to stay close to Daniel and Maya during her recovery rather than be shuttled off to an unfamiliar care facility. Then, gradually, Victoria came back because she wanted to. She watched Daniel work himself to exhaustion, trying to keep the shop's lights on while still finding time to braid Maya's hair before school and read Eleanor her favorite mystery novels at night. She watched him refuse 3 separate times when she tried to simply hand him a check for his trouble. "I didn't do it for money," he told her firmly the 3rd time, sliding the folded check back across the table. "If you hand me a check, it turns something real into a transaction. I don't want that. Not for this." It was Maya, in the end, who unknowingly changed his mind. Not about taking money, but about accepting help. The girl had been struggling in school, falling behind because Daniel simply didn't have time between the shop and caregiving to help her with reading. When Victoria noticed Maya sounding out words with visible frustration one evening, she quietly arranged, without asking Daniel first, for a retired teacher she trusted to come by twice a week, free of charge, as a favor, she insisted. Not charity. Daniel wanted to refuse that too, out of pride, but the sight of his daughter's face lighting up after finally reading an entire book cover to cover on her own broke something loose in his resistance. He realized slowly that there was a difference between refusing charity meant to buy his gratitude and accepting genuine partnership from people who had simply become family, because that's what they had become, an unlikely family. Eleanor's health stabilized under consistent care and the steady rhythm of Daniel and Maya's household. Victoria found herself driving out to that modest neighborhood not out of obligation, but because Sunday dinners at Daniel's cramped kitchen table, with mismatched chairs and a signature request for Maya's terrible but adorable pasta creations, had become the highlight of her exhausting week. For a woman who commanded boardrooms and closed billion-dollar deals, there was something profoundly grounding about a home where nobody wanted anything from her except her presence. Then came the storm. Not literal rain this time, but a different kind. The bank that held the note on Daniel's auto shop, the same shop his father had built from nothing decades earlier, informed him that due to a missed payment during the month he'd been consumed with caring for Eleanor, they were accelerating foreclosure. 30 days to pay off the remaining balance, or lose everything his family had built. Daniel didn't tell Victoria. He didn't tell anyone. He worked double shifts, took every job that came through the door, sold his father's old motorcycle that had sat untouched in the garage for years, all in a desperate scramble to save the one thing that let him provide for Maya. But it wasn't enough, and with 3 days left before the deadline, he sat alone in the shop after closing, staring at the foreclosure notice, wondering how he was going to explain to his daughter that they might lose the roof over their heads. That's when Eleanor found him. She'd insisted on coming by that evening, and when she saw his face, she didn't need an explanation. Eleanor Whitfield might have struggled to remember directions or names some days, but there was nothing wrong with her ability to read heartbreak on the face of a man who'd given her a home when she had nowhere else to go. "You didn't tell Victoria," she said softly. I couldn't, Daniel admitted, his voice breaking for the first time since this whole journey began. She's already given us so much. I won't let her think this is why I helped you. I won't let her think I was ever after something. Eleanor reached out and took his rough, calloused hand in her frail one. My husband built an empire out of nothing, Daniel. Do you know what he used to say? He said the measure of a deal was never the money. It was whether both sides walked away with dignity intact. You gave me my dignity back when I had lost even my own name. Let us give you the chance to keep yours. The next morning, Victoria showed up at the shop without calling first, holding a folder Daniel hadn't asked for and didn't want. Inside wasn't a check made out to cover his debt. She knew him well enough by now to understand that a handout would wound his pride more than it would help him. Instead, it was a proposal. Her company's logistics division needed a regional vehicle maintenance and fleet servicing partner. A real contract, real work, fair market rate, with Daniel's shop as the primary vendor for an entire fleet of company vehicles across 3 counties. This isn't a gift, Victoria said firmly before he could even open his mouth to protest. This is a business contract. Read the terms. Negotiate if you don't like something. We need a reliable, honest mechanic who won't cut corners, and in 4 months of watching you work, I've never met anyone more qualified. If you say no, I'll simply have to keep looking. And frankly, that would be a headache I don't have time for. Daniel stared at the papers, his hands trembling, not with the shame of charity, but with the dizzying, overwhelming relief of being seen not as a charity case, but as someone worth investing in. He signed the contract 3 days later, the same day the foreclosure deadline would have expired. The shop that his father built, the shop that had once seemed destined to slip through his fingers no matter how hard he fought, was saved, not by a handout, but by an opportunity earned through nothing more than the character he'd shown a stranger on a rainy night, expecting nothing in return. Word spread quickly through the small community about what had happened. Not the business details, which Daniel kept private, but the story itself. A single father who'd taken in a lost, elderly stranger with nothing but kindness in his heart, never knowing she'd turn out to be the mother of one of the wealthiest women in the country, and never asking for a single thing in return. Some called it luck. Daniel never saw it that way. He saw it as simply the natural consequence of choosing to be decent, when it would have been so much easier to look away. A year later, the auto shop had tripled its staff to keep up with the new fleet contracts, all local hires, all people Daniel personally vouched for, continuing the same philosophy his father had instilled in him. Maya was reading 2 grade levels ahead, thriving under her tutor's guidance, and blooming with the confidence of a child who felt fiercely, unconditionally loved by an ever-growing circle of people who cared for her. Eleanor's geranium had multiplied into an entire garden along the side of the house, tended every weekend by a woman who now remembered, more often than not, exactly who she was and exactly where she belonged, which was there, in that modest house, surrounded by the family who had never once asked what she was worth. And Victoria, the woman who once measured success in acquisitions and quarterly growth, found herself sitting at that same cramped kitchen table nearly every Sunday, her sleeves rolled up, laughing over Maya's latest culinary disaster, watching her mother thrive in a home built from nothing but sacrifice and love. She'd built an empire chasing the belief that success meant accumulating more. It took a stranger's kindness toward her lost mother to teach her what her mother had apparently always known. True wealth was never about what you could buy. It was about what you were willing to give without expecting anything back. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, Daniel would stand in the doorway of his kitchen and watch the 3 of them. Maya sprawled across the floor with her homework, Eleanor humming softly as she stirred a pot on the stove, Victoria scrolling through emails with one hand while stealing bites of garlic bread with the other. And he would feel a gratitude so overwhelming it nearly buckled his knees. He thought about that first rainy night more often than he expected to. Not with pride, but with a quiet, humbling disbelief that something so small, so instinctive, had unraveled into all of this. He hadn't been thinking about consequences or rewards when he crossed that flooded street. He'd only been thinking about a cold, frightened stranger who needed somebody, anybody, to stop and notice her. Maya, older now and fiercely proud of the family she'd helped stitch together with a stuffed rabbit and a paper crane, liked to tell people at school that her grandmother wasn't really her grandmother. Not by blood, but that didn't matter one bit, because love was the only ingredient that had ever really counted in their house. Eleanor liked to tell that same story a little differently, insisting that it was Maya's rabbit, tucked so gently beside her that first terrifying night, that had truly saved her. Long before medicine, long before Victoria's arrival, long before any of the practical miracles that followed. And Victoria, when asked by journalists eager to profile the billionaire heiress behind a heartwarming viral story, always corrected them on one crucial point. This wasn't a story about a billionaire saving a struggling family. It was a story about a struggling family saving a billionaire from the coldest, loneliest version of success she'd nearly settled for. Daniel Reyes never set out to change anyone's life. He simply couldn't walk past a shivering old woman standing alone in the rain. But sometimes the smallest acts of decency, the ones we do without calculation, without hope for recognition or reward, end up rewriting the entire story of everyone they touch. He gave Eleanor shelter when she had nothing. In return, without ever intending it, he was given something far greater than money could ever buy. A family whose bond was forged not in blood, but in the simple, radical decision to help a stranger because, as Daniel always said, somebody has to. The little auto shop still sits on that same corner, the same tin roof still rattling whenever a storm rolls through. Though these days the leaks have finally been patched, and the sign out front has been repainted in Maya's careful, crooked handwriting. Locals say if you drive by on a Sunday evening, you can still see the lights on in the small house down the road, hear laughter spilling out through an open window, smell something wonderful and slightly burnt coming from the kitchen. Nobody driving past would ever guess that inside sat one of the wealthiest women on the West Coast, sharing a table with a mechanic, his daughter, and the mother she almost lost, bound together forever by nothing more than a single decision made in the pouring rain to stop and ask a stranger if she was okay. If this story touched you the way it touched me while writing it, remember that kindness costs nothing, but often means everything to the person receiving it. Somewhere out there tonight, someone else is standing in their own version of the rain, waiting for someone to simply stop and ask if they're okay. Be that person. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs the reminder that good still exists in this world.